Thank you. Thank you. Now let's talk about that crawl space basement stuff. What's that all about? We have a crawl space. I don't like crawl spaces. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever heard anybody get excited about a crawl space? When was the last time somebody said, "We have a finished crawl space"? We put a full bath down there. It's tough to shower. You know, people don't talk like that. We have a game room in our crawl space. Took the legs off the pool table. Nobody talks about crawl spaces like that. They're not exciting. I do have to admit, though, that over here in the parsonage, that is one of the nicest crawl spaces I've ever seen. You don't have to crawl. That in itself is wonderful. You do have to walk bent over, though. And that kind of, after a while, it's kind of rough in the back. And it is the driest crawl space that I've ever seen. That's phenomenal. How many have had a damp crawl space? Yeah, damp. I think it's written somewhere they have to be damp. And they have to have cobwebs, right? You know, I do like our crawl space. I can put stuff under there, and I know it's going to be okay because it's dry. But I have a bone to pick with whoever put the light in that crawl space. You walk down the stairs, turn to your left, go into the laundry room. Right over here to your left is a small doorway that you go into the crawl space, okay? Now, as soon as you take that door off to go into the crawl space, about 12 to 15 feet away is a light bulb with a string on it. That's fun. Yeah. I bumped my knees, and you walk right into the cobwebs, as you're trying to get to the light. Follow the light. But it's not on. Crawl spaces. But, I've learned a lot from working in crawl spaces, fixing things and crawling around under there in the wet and the mud and the cobwebs and the little creatures scurrying around. I've learned a lot about what it means to be a servant of God. Strange place to learn that, but I have. Because just like a crawl space is not comfortable, it's not pleasant, it's not something you want to do, sometimes that's how it is with being a servant of the Lord. It means being willing to go out of our comfort zone, being willing to do what nobody else really wants to do. It means sometimes having to get ourselves a little bit dirty and a little less dignified as we crawl around under there. I've learned a lot from crawl spaces. I've learned the posture of what it means to be a servant of God. Now, today's a special day. This is a special weekend for three reasons in particular, one of which we've already participated in. We've remembered those who've touched our lives, and perhaps they've been a servant to you in some way or another. Melissa was sharing about great-grandparents who'd exemplified for her characteristics of a servant. Today's also a special day because on this date in the Christian calendar, we celebrate Pentecost Sunday. That's why you see the red with the doves and the fire. We're celebrating the gift of God's Spirit, the Spirit of God given to all followers of Jesus Christ, who's given to enable us to be servants of Christ. Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit. In other words, they go hand in hand. When we submit our lives to Christ, we give our lives to Him as a servant. The Spirit fills and empowers. There's another reason why today's special, and I think it's really cool that it fell on this date. In the history of the United Methodist Church, May 24th has always been known as Aldersgate Day for a very significant reason. It all started with the founding father of the Methodist movement in 18th century England, John Wesley. It was on this date, May 24, 1738, when he was about 35 years old. He went to a Bible study on Aldersgate Street in London, England. He went there despondent and feeling down. But after he left that Bible study, he was empowered. God had touched his heart. He said, and wrote in his journal later, I felt my heart strangely warmed. He finally had that assurance that Christ was his Savior. And out of that incredible life-changing experience, the Methodist movement was literally born. Now, John Wesley was born in 1703, and he died March 3rd, 1791. But in his lifetime of serving the Lord and spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ in the form of the Methodist movement as we know it, His life was remarkable, an incredible life of a servant. I want you to think about this for a moment. This is in the 18th century England. No modern means of transportation, no modern means of communication, no high-tech stuff whatsoever. When that man died, he had traveled in excess of 250,000 miles, most by horseback, later on by buggy as he was an elderly man. He traveled from town to town and community to community, spreading the Methodist movement, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ and touching hearts. In his lifetime, he preached more than 40,000 sermons. Think about that for a moment, folks. I know that's more than just two sermons each week on Sunday morning. It's a lot more than that. He was out and about. When he was no longer welcome in the churches of England, he went out and found a place to hold worship services. Early in the mornings, before the sun came out, he would go to the coal mines and meet the miners as they were coming to work. And at the opening of a coal mine, he would hold worship services and he would preach to them. He would go out into the street corners. He would go out into the fields and preach the gospel. He got into the crawl space. In his lifetime, he wrote over 200 books. When he died, he left behind over 200 Methodist preachers and over 300,000 members of that early movement. He was a servant of the Lord. He spent a lot of time in the crawl space, putting others first, selfless acts of laying down his life. That's what it means to be a servant of the Lord. Now, I'm thinking about this Sunday, thinking about Memorial Day weekend and what it means, at least what it means to me. I'm thinking about those who have gone before us in the military or some other way, or loved ones that have blessed our lives, and we think of their lives as some of those selfless acts that they demonstrated. There's one man in particular, besides Jesus, that catches my attention when I think about a servant of the Lord. And it's the man today that we're looking at, Joshua. You will be hard-pressed to find anyone with such a spotless character as Joshua other than Christ himself. In fact, quite frankly, if you read through the Old and New Testament and look at all the characters of the Bible, male and female, you will find a very small handful who exemplified the kind of life that Joshua did. Read through the book of Joshua, just those 24 chapters. Read through those 24 chapters and try to find moments when he gave up, when he quit, when he threw in the towel, when he said, God, I'm not going to serve you anymore. He was a servant of the Lord. Notice, as we read a portion of his obituary this morning, did you hear how it started out? Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord. In other words, say no more. No titles, no long list of accomplishments. You could have filled pages. No accolades, nothing like that. But all in one powerful phrase, Joshua, the servant of the Lord. What an incredible life he lived. For in excess of 40 years, he shadowed Moses. When they left the land of Egypt, he was at Moses' side, and Moses was his mentor. And he shadowed Moses and devoted himself to following Moses and learning from that man. And through that experience and through the devotion of Joshua's life, he was known as a man after God's own heart. That's how the Bible described him in the book of Numbers, in Numbers 13 and 14. Joshua was a man who followed God wholeheartedly. He was a servant of the Lord. And I look at Joshua's life. I look at John Wesley's life. And other lives where I've seen what it means to be a servant of God. And I wonder, what do they all have in common? What do these individuals share? And I find it's very simple. It's basically three simple principles that we see exemplified in the life of Joshua. Those three simple things. First and foremost, Joshua was a follower. He was a follower. He was willing to submit. He was willing to follow. One of the first times we read of Joshua in the Bible is in Exodus chapter 24, verse 13. And where do we find him? At Moses' side. He was with Moses. He shadowed Moses. He was with Moses during the most significant times and events in the history of Israel as they wandered through the wilderness. He was by Moses' side. When Moses said, Joshua, jump, Joshua asked, how high? He led in battle. He led the troops. He stood faithful to God. When the other people, when the thousands and thousands of children of Israel would cry out and complain and say, let us go back to Egypt, Joshua remained true and he followed after Moses. He was a follower. That's what it takes to be a servant of Jesus Christ. We devote ourselves to following him. I heard something really neat last weekend when I was at conference. Somebody said something really simple, and it just hit home with me. Somebody said we have to stop trying to be Christians. And instead, we have to start training to be Christians. There's a difference. Stop trying to be a Christian and start training to be one. When you're training for something, you just keep at it. And if you mess up and you fall down and you don't get it right, you get up and you go again. And you keep training and keep going after it. And you don't give up. But if I'm trying, I'm going to get locked into perfection. I'm going to get locked into my own effort, thinking I can do it all under my own power. And I've got to stop doing that and just say, I'm a servant in training. I'm a servant in training. And follow him. The Apostle Paul never lost sight of that. Even as later in his ministry, he's writing from a prison cell to a man that he had mentored, a man by the name of Titus. And Paul began his greeting to Titus very simply by saying to him, the Apostle Paul, Titus chapter 1, verse 1, the Apostle Paul, a servant of God. That's it. He could have sung his own praises. He could have bragged on himself. He could have, just like Melissa said, he could have bragged on himself all that he'd done for God. But he just said, I'm just a servant. I follow. We have to be followers. The second thing is that humility factor, being humble. Joshua remained a humble man. He humbly obeyed Moses and walked with him and served with him and was faithful to him. And that humility remained deep in his heart even when Joshua took over the reins of leadership over the people of Israel. After he led them into the promised land, when they first crossed the Jordan and they were in the promised land, the first battle they were going to have to face was the city of Jericho, which was locked up securely, so they couldn't get in. Joshua chapter 5, verse 14 tells us on the night before that battle would begin, Joshua was alone and he met with a messenger of God. And as you read in Joshua 5:14, the first thing that Joshua did when he met the messenger of God, it says he got down on his face. He humbled himself. He humbled himself before the Lord. The most powerful position you can take is to humble yourself in the presence of God. That's powerful. When you put yourself down and say, it's all about you. When you humble yourself according to the Scripture, it means it's an act of selfless submission. I'm yours. Mold me and shape me. You're the potter, I'm the clay. He just gave himself to the Lord. Joshua, he was already the leader. He had been through the crawl space with Moses. He had bragging rights. He's taken over the lead. He got him into the promised land. But the first thing he did in the presence of God was he humbled himself. We humble ourselves. And finally, what it takes to be a servant of the Lord is we have to be determined. It's swimming upstream. It's going against the grain. It cuts across society. Well, the common attitude of our society and culture today is summed up in a question. What's in it for me? What's in it for me? What am I going to get out of this? Whether we're walking into a restaurant, into a store, or sometimes into the church. What's in it for me? That's not a servant of the Lord. That's not even a vocabulary. It's all about you, God. It's all about you, not me. What's in it for everybody that's around me? That's all I care about right now. What's in it for them? I'm determined. I know our society doesn't think that way. Our culture doesn't think that way. And do you see how we're doing today? Have you looked around? It's not working very well, is it? Determined to be a servant of the Lord. Joshua was determined. He got down to the end of his life, this 24th chapter of Joshua. Earlier in this chapter, where you can read his swan song, his last words to the people of Israel. Think about all that he's accomplished. He faithfully was at the side of Moses for at least 40 years. He was the man that led them across the Jordan River into the Promised Land. He was the man that led them in battles and did not give up. He was the man who established them in their areas of the whole Promised Land. He was the man who parceled out each one of the tribes of Israel. He was the man. He could have said so much about himself in his swan song. But he made it all about God. One of the most beautiful verses in the Bible is Joshua 24:15. Talking to all those people. He puts the cards out on the table. Okay, folks, here we are. Now you can choose. You can serve the gods of these people here in this land that we've just taken over, or you can serve the gods of Egypt. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Down to the very end. His closing words, we will serve the Lord. Determined to serve God. The Apostle Paul was writing his letter to the church at Philippi when he was in a Roman prison. When he was in the crawl space. And in Philippians 3, verses 13 and 14, he put it very well. He said, this is determination. This one thing I do, forgetting all that lays behind, I press on. I press on for the goal of Christ. I am determined. Takes determination. Moses led the children of Israel out of bondage, out of slavery to Egypt. But when it came time to lead him into the Promised Land, God needed someone who he knew with unfaltering devotion would lead them into the Promised Land. That man was Joshua. You know, when Joseph heard that Mary was going to have a baby, he was worried. How'd this all come about? The Bible tells us in the first chapter of Matthew that an angel came to Joseph to explain it to him. And in the 21st verse of Matthew chapter 1, that angel said something very important to Joseph. Said, you will name this boy Jesus, Jesus, Greek, which is the Greek name for the Hebrew name Joshua. And both of those names mean the same thing. The Lord saves. The Lord saves. And what did Jesus say about himself? The Son of Man has come not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. That's what God is looking for. That's what it takes to save and to change lives. As followers of Jesus Christ, we need to follow his example as we devote ourselves to him, to realize that to be called the servant of the Lord is the highest calling. The 34th chapter of Deuteronomy, it's the end of Moses' life. Moses, on a couple of occasions, did not honor God, one time in particular. So God said to Moses, you are not the man to bring my people into the Promised Land, but I will allow you to see the promised land. So he and the children of Israel were in the plains of Moab on the eastern side of the Jordan River. That close to being in the promised land. And God said, you can go up onto Mount Nebo, and you will be able to see the promised land, but you will not enter. So Moses went up on Mount Nebo. Nebo means a high mountain. It was also a place where ancient pagan deities were worshipped. But from that ancient pagan place, all Moses could do was take a glimpse over there and see that close. And then the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy 34, then after that, Moses was buried in the valley of Beth Peor. And one of the things it says in that chapter, 34th chapter of Deuteronomy was, and nobody knows where he was buried. He was a servant of the Lord. Joshua, on the other hand, son of Nun, a servant of the Lord, he was buried in the land of his inheritance, in Seraph, in the tribal land of Ephraim. If you had a map of Israel, Old Testament Israel, in front of you, and you could plot out the spot where the Bible refers to, you would find out that Joshua was buried right in the middle of it all, right in the middle of Israel, right in the very center of it, pretty much, in the middle of it all. As I think about that, I think, what an honor. They know where his grave's at. It's right in the middle of the nation, right in the middle of everything. But as I follow the life of Joshua, I think he would probably say, no, could you just kind of bury me off where nobody knows? Because it's not about me. It's not about me. That's a servant of the Lord, folks. That's the highest calling you can have on your life, is to be a servant of the Lord.